Hi, my name is Marcelo Bocato. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and I'm presenting today this paper for AMS conference titled Samba is Black, Unmaking Race in a Raceless Genre. The term samba, originally used to describe generic musical gatherings of enslaved and free black Brazilians during the 19th century, became associated with a specific commercial genre of popular music in the 1930s. Samba, the genre, became one of the essential symbols of national identity and was celebrated for its ability to represent the fraternity between white and black Brazilians. Historians have documented the constant musical exchanges between Rio de Janeiro's white and black communities, as well as the development of non segregated neighborhoods where self-manumitted Africans and poor European immigrants lived in shared spaces. Musical styles that later became associated with samba were shaped in such spaces, and white and black musicians often performed together in events or ensembles. Yet, Rio de Janeiro's periodicals show that audiences continue to perceive distinct forms of the genre based on race. Drawing from archival research that includes dozens of periodicals from Rio de Janeiro and commercial recordings of music from 1900 to 1930, this paper examines how audiences and musicians in the city reinforced or challenged racialized notions of sound and music. Identify practices of white musicians, critics, and audiences that narrowly define samba as a strategy aimed at racializing music and its black practitioners. The work of whiteness was characterized by discourses and practices that reinforced notions of white superiority, not only by rejecting specific aural elements that were perceived as black, but also appropriating those elements while attributing its improved character to white musicians. Black musicians, on the other hand, made constant artistic interventions that asserted samba's historical connections to black aesthetics. These interventions did not result in an essentialized expression of blackness. Rather, black music constantly defied models and maintaining a commitment to improvisatory practices allowed black musicians and communities to explore the many expressions of their lived experiences. This paper builds on Nina Eidsheim's concept of the race of sound to argue that erasing sound as black is always a historically contingent act that can be used as a strategy to maintain racial hierarchies. But also, when black communities and black musicians name music as black or use sounds that are perceived as black in a conscious and intentive way of building a black aesthetics, that is also a way of breaking from racial logics and racial idealizations of music and constructing an idea of black and blackness that is about relations and about music as a way of building those communities, not as an object that describes or shows their blackness. So to begin here, I will present a quick timeline of samba and of my research and why I chose this period of 1900 to 1930. So my research begins in the 1830s and it goes all the way to 1870s. I identify this first period from 1830s to the beginning of the 20th century, where the term samba was used alongside with batuque. Uh, uh, and those terms were used strictly to musical events of black communities, and they were those events, the batuques and sambas, they were outlawed, and they represented alterity. So when used batuque and samba, there was a sense of difference and difference that was racialized. During the 1880s, the term machixe was used by white people when referring to the dance music of the elite and middle class salons. Dance music that was based on European forms, especially like polka, but already influenced by habanera and samba. This later period from 1930s to 1960s is when samba becomes associated with the project of multiracial nation. Stylistic elements associated with black musical practices are placed at the center of the genre now, and the 1930s inaugurates the period that is called the golden age of samba. So the period I'm focusing today is from 1902 to 1930, and it's a transition period from the time when samba was used as something strictly to refer to black musical practices and as a symbol of alterity, to this point where samba becomes the national genre. 1902 is the first commercial recording of music in Rio de Janeiro, and in 1916, we have Donga's recording of Pelo Telefone that was released in 1917. And this recording helped consolidate the use of the term samba to a specific genre of music. So this is a transition period, and it's an important period too because it's when we have access to recordings of music by Black musicians and by white musicians as well. So samba would develop an important public presence in the city of Rio de Janeiro in the first 2 decades of the 20th century during the Festas da Penha. Festas da Penha were part of the religious calendar of Catholic Church in Rio de Janeiro, but it became increasingly Black. And you can see here a picture of a Festa da Penha from 1910, and we see all Black people. There's one man here with a guitar, another one with a cavaquinho, which is the smaller guitar, the women with their white clothing. And the description of this picture says, last Sunday, the folks from Pingun do Romã, which is the name of the group, are getting ready for the groovy samba at the Penha Fair, or the Festa, the national gathering of the well-known groups of Portuguese who sing and dance. So the picture clearly shows a group of Black men, but the text describes a group of Portuguese or groups of Portuguese who are performing at the Penha Fair. This one is another picture from 1913. The sambas, also called batuques, that were becoming more popular at this festa, the Festa da Penha, were also a constant reason for controversy. So the city would outlaw it sometimes, then they would allow it, but there was a lot of police repression. 1913 is when they allowed it again. And we can see here this picture with the focus on this man, this Black man, at the center of the picture playing the pandeiro, which was an instrument that was very associated with Black culture. And also the Black men in suits. So these were, they were called pandegos. This was a pejorative term used to describe this kind of criminal, low criminal Black person. But we can see here that all of these Black men were wearing suits in a way of defying this characterization. And in 1914, there was something interesting in Rio de Janeiro's press. So first, the batuques were prohibited. These ceremonies were happening on every Sunday of the month of October. In the first 2 Sundays, they were prohibited, but on the third one, they reallowed. So the Correio da Manhã, a newspaper, says the batuques reappeared on the third Sunday, and they were present again yesterday, and even in larger number. Some of the pilgrims lost control. Those pilgrims were white Catholic people participating in the procession, and joined the samba, causing a lot of scandal in people around them. And on that same week, on another paper, we have a different article talking about this. More than 50,000 people were there in a mix of sacred and profane, paying penance and dancing machixe at the sick sound of the guitar and cavaquinho. The traditional Festa da Penha, with its characteristic Portuguese pilgrimages, is being transformed by this innovation. Now, the vira and the fado, which were styles of Portuguese music, are being replaced by the indigenous samba and the groovy machixe from Brazil. There were country dances everywhere, even at the terreiro in front of the House of the Brotherhood. The terreiro is a term that was frequently associated with Afro-Brazilian communities, and the brotherhoods were Catholic associations where there were some of them that were predominantly Black. There at the terreiro, the band of the police brigade was playing, and people were dancing, just like at the events at Cidade Nova. Cidade Nova, also a neighborhood known for a large population of Black people, where these dance gatherings happened at homes. And those people dancing at the Festa da Penha, they were dancing to the machixe, the groovy and lascivious machixe, some more or less pornographic, based on the couples dancing. So already here, this idea of lasciviousness and the sexuality brought by the pornographic, and the distinction here that the author is making is based on who is dancing. So some couples were less pornographic, others were more. And on the next slide, he will give us the example of why exactly that happened. So he says, so there was the machixe of the carnival clubs, the machixe of the salons, and even the machixe from the favela. Some of the couples dancing were also from the celebrated morro of this capital. So the term machixe now is being used somewhat interchangeably with samba, but he's making a distinction between those being played at the carnival clubs, which were clubs of middle class, those played at the salons, which were usually clubs of the high elites, and the machixe from the favela, which was one of the morros or the hillside communities, the shanty towns in Rio de Janeiro, that became known as a place where a lot of black people who were dispossessed in the city went to. And at this time, they already had a reputation of crime and of low sanitation. So for a person in Rio de Janeiro reading this, they clearly read this as a racialized description. So I want to understand what exactly they were perceiving and hearing that made this distinction. Uh, we already have a strong group of musicians in the city who had a lot of different experiences of music that reflected both notions of traditional and modern music. The professionalization of black musicians increased gradually during the 20th century, in the process changing the attitudes of music performance. Traditional music practices of black communities were perceived as predominantly participatory in contexts of religious or social gatherings. By contrast, modern popular music in early 20th century Brazil comprised a broad range of stylistic elements and processes of music making. Stylistic, there was an emphasis on the role of composers and arrangers, the harmonic and formal development of music composition based on European dance styles like schotch, polka, waltz, and mazurka, and instrumentation based on European military bands. Black music performed in professional settings was increasingly presentational with delineated roles distinguishing between musicians, listeners, and dancers, taking place in clearly demarcated spaces and to some extent was recorded and disseminated through audio recording and later the radio. The new professional opportunities, however, did not completely replace participatory and informal performances. Instead, they both constituted spaces of black music making. The constant circulation of music between these spaces was essential to the process of negotiating musical meaning and the creation of an aesthetics of black music in Rio de Janeiro. So to play a small example here, I have selected an example from the Banda do Corpo de Bombeiros. This was one of the premier ensembles where you have black musicians performing and black musicians leading to. Anacato de Madeiras was a composer, a leader, a conductor, and one of the most important musicians at this time. So what is really impressive about this recording is the amount of stuff that is extra that you cannot really fit into the lead sheet or into the sheet music that they were writing for the band. So the accents, the type of interlocking rhythms, the ability to play rhythms that are more commetric or more syncopated and still swing and keep time. So all of this is what creates the interest. But then when you compare this to a band of musicians that were mostly white, we can hear a big difference on this. Those were larger ensembles. We also have a lot of smaller ensembles. We can see here two guitars accompanying a brass quintet. This was a group of the trumpet player called Luiz de Souza, who was also a member of the Banda do Corpo de Bombeiros. Irineu Amenda was also a member of that group, and he would find another really important ensemble called Show do Carioca. Many of their members were also members of the Ranchos Carnavalescos, or groups that were organizing the carnival parades, and those were more community-based groups that were connected again to those religious events and carnival as well. And it is in this group that we find the first recording of what we today consider samba. So at that time, there was a distinction between the music that we just heard that was based on the forms of dance music from Europe. So usually you have a three-part form, A, B, C. It's a rondo form, so it's usually A, B, B, A, C, C, A. The harmony is a little bit more complex. You have modulation. Each section is in a different key. The melodies are a little bit more complex as well. Samba, the thing that people were calling samba was the music that was improvised, and it was based on verse and call and response, and usually a very simplified harmonic idea of 1-5-1 or 1-4-1. And here's the first recording that I found that reflects this practice. We don't have the percussion here, but we have them playing the exact same instruments as they were playing the instrumental versions of this music.
Di Maria, per cordão de ouro, Dio retrato di Maria, per cordão de ouro, ela vai eu para a ela voltei, ela vai eu para a ela voltei, cercaria lo si come tu vas a caer a tu ela lhe disse como se trabalho, como isso meio
This type of song was already somewhat popular among middle class people, but usually they performed it only accompanying a piano and a singer. So already it was called, sometimes they would call it lundu or lundu song, but this would be the same model used for later samba recordings of white musicians.
Ao povo damos sempre alegria e batalhamos pela folia. Ao povo damos sempre alegria e batalhamos pela folia.
And we see again that they lose that kind of groove. It feels really stiff, and it's because at this time they're already using syncopation as a symbol of blackness. So they white people performing samba and lundu were only able to incorporate that which they could translate into sheet music and that which they chose as something that belonged to their culture. So there was a clearly separation here in terms of sound. By 1916, when Donga, a black composer, registered his composition Pelo Telefone, this would be the one of the first compositions of samba to be registered in a lead sheet. And you can see here the part of the piano, again, we see that same syncopated phrase here. And the guitar player is going to play this throughout the recording. So I have a feeling that it was somebody who was not also very familiar with the style when he had to follow this very closely. And this also kind of takes away from that rhythmic energy and richness of the music.
Pelo telefone manda me avisar que com alegria não se questione para se brincar. Ai, 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 é deixar mágoas pra trás, oh rapaz. Ai, 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 fica triste se é capaz de velar. Ai, ai, é deixar mágoas pra trás, oh rapaz.
So at this period, we start seeing this emergency of two different ways of performing samba. One where you have white musicians following the lead sheet, and the other one is where you have black musicians performing in a way that combines a lot of different ideas and musicalities. And those musicians were not following one strict pattern. They were trading ideas with each other. I can find throughout this period a lot of ideas are merging and becoming a new pattern. Then something else comes up. So it's a creative process where new ideas are always adding up to old ideas. But we see this differentiation as a way, there's a narrative of evolution here that's going to come up. At this time, they were still using the term machixe to separate from samba, but it was becoming less and less frequent. And here in 1919, a music critic wrote, machixe was born from samba, like samba was born from lundu, and lundu from batuque, and batuque from caterete. Lundu, batuque, caterete are old dances brought in by the African slaves, and for that reason were developed in Bahia. The Dança Lundu de Rugendas, a travel writer, collected while visiting the slaves in Rio de Janeiro, is our samba, the precursor of the contemporary machixe from the saloons. So there's a clear break here between the modern machixe, the one that they heard played by white musicians, and the old samba, the one they were being hearing from black musicians. So I want to conclude here, bringing it back to the beginning of the conversation, when I mentioned Nina Eidsheim's book, The Race of Sound, and she very accurately describes the process of racialization of sound, of assigning a racial meaning to music, to sound, in particular to voice. And this racial meaning becomes an object that people use to distinguish between black and non-black, and to racialize people, music, bodies, ways of thinking musically. And Nina offers an idea of relational listening to break away from these racial stereotypes. And Georgina Bourne will also talk about the relational approach to musicology. But I want to propose something else here, and I want to bring this picture. This was published on a newspaper in Rio de Janeiro in 1910, and it's called Costumes of Rio de Janeiro, or Traditions of Rio de Janeiro. And this is a samba at Cidade Nova. And we see here a house that represents houses from this neighborhood of Cidade Nova that have a very important place on the oral history of samba. And we can see three musicians here performing dance music in a place that is obviously predominantly black. And we have a guitar player, a flute player, and the euphonium, or a tuba player here. And they were playing the kind of music, instrumental modern music, that people were beginning to disassociate with blackness. And these houses, they were famous for having different kinds of music. So the living room, you would have this kind of ball dance music, or salon dance music. So you would have the performance of instrumental music there. Going inside, you would have the type of sambas where you would have less instruments, it was more percussion, dancing, and in the back, you would have the kind of music that you have in candomblé or the Afro-Brazilian religions. So the way Nina Eidsheim's book talks about the construction of a black idea of music is always an object that is used to racialize. But this is a space where black women in particular, who were community leaders, they were building these spaces so that black musicians and black communities could experience their own idea of a tradition, of a musical tradition, but that doesn't fit according to the boundaries of race as the society was starting to establish. So as samba became a more modern product and a product of modern music industry, we start seeing a separation between this modern music that white middle classes could consume, the music that would be in the, published as a sheet music or as audio recording or in the radio, in concerts, and that is the kind of music that became more associated with white people. And they were using blackness as almost a source of tradition from which white people could take this. And so black people needed to be in this position of tradition, of primitiveness. And the point that I'm getting from this research is that it's not so much that we simply have to break away from this, but actually that we have to listen to what is it that they are pointing out. What is the knowledge that those musicians are building? And the knowledge here really is that the music is not an object. The music is about building the communities. So these black women who are community leaders, they realized the importance of these new professional musicians, these musicians who were interested in music that was considered European, and they created a space where they could be accepted as a part of a community, not as an object. And so these musicians were transitioning from one place to the other, from the place of candomblé, of the more religious experience, to the place of music that is social, dance, and you have improvisation, and you have the processions in the city, to the place where they're performing in the kind of couples dancing based on the polka and the music that they were performing in other places of the city. So understanding that there is a point, there is something more important here than simply listening to this music without the racial lens, but understanding that actually this music was black music for black freedom. It was Black music for Black communities. And learning to listen to this, and learning to perceive the histories that are behind this music, and learning to perceive the histories that are behind the styles and the ideas and the kind of rhythmic variety and richness that they have, is part of the challenge of learning the Black tradition of music, learning the Black tradition of aesthetics, but as a way of understanding the community, and as a way of connecting, having a way to connect to this community as white people, as a white man. This music has been a way, and my training with jazz has been a way for me to connect with these communities, and to connect with people, and to learn about the tradition, and to understand that I have to pass through this process. I can't simply come in and say, hey, I'm going to listen to your music in my way. I have to pass through this process and be changed by it. So the main point of this presentation is that the perception that there was something different wasn't made up. There really was something different. So the point isn't just ignore the differences, but rather, what do we do when we see something different? And the reaction of white people in Rio de Janeiro was use difference as a marker of racial difference, that is, of essential alterity. There's no possibility for a relationship. Black people are always going to be separate, are always going to be primitive, and whenever they get closer, it's because they are being modernized by the contact with white civilization. And what I see from Black music here is that, no, we understand the difference, but as something that is important for me to learn and to connect. So this different way of being a musical community, of being a musical individual, was important for them. And for me to simply disregard that, the Black tradition would be to disregard this important and rich tradition. So instead of rejecting simply, the point is learning to look at music then not as an object, but as a way of creating relationships and communities. And this is what I'm getting from this research, and what I'm trying to develop in my larger book project. So thank you for listening. And if you come to the session tomorrow, Saturday at 10 a.m., I'd love to get your questions.